Hello and welcome back. In this part 5 of 5-Minute Photoshop, we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the aspects of working with layers. In the previous video we covered all the essential parts, and in this part we're going to take a look at some of the advanced features. So let's jump in and have a look. Now the first thing I wanted to mention is that when we're working with our basic image layer and we open it in Photoshop, if we look down at the very bottom left hand corner, you'll see some information here. If I click on this little arrow, it gives me a number of options that it can display here. But what we're interested in is looking at the document size. And when in this particular image, this photograph's been opened, it's 189.9 megabytes. So what happens when we add an adjustment layer, we only incrementally add to that file size. But if I was to make a duplicate of the image layer and apply a filter to it, let's say using one of the artistic filters or the Nik filters or whatever, so I've now duplicated that original layer and I now have a copy of the background layer, you can see now that my file size has virtually doubled. And so when we're working with layers in Photoshop, we need to be mindful that if we add another image layer to our photograph, we're going to dramatically increase the file size. So let's now have a look at what happens with another photograph, which is the same version of this, where we've added just adjustment layers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that layer for the moment. And you'll see here that all I've got now is adjustment layers and the base layer, and our image size has gone from 189 megabytes to 280. So it's added somewhat to the file size, but not massively. So that's one important thing to consider when we're working with multiple image layers. Now I'm going to just undo deleting that because I want that for a little bit later on. Now the second thing we want to have a look at is when we create an adjustment layer in Photoshop, Photoshop automatically gives it a name, and it can be fairly misleading if you don't really know what you're doing. But when you create an adjustment layer, you can rename it simply by coming over with your mouse cursor to the name, double click on it, you'll see it's highlighted, and then we can call it whatever we like. And I might just call this one Sky Adjustment. And so as you go through, if you want to make sure you know what you've done on each layer, you can give each layer a name as you go. So that's another simple way that we can keep control of our layers in Photoshop. And the next thing that we looked at, we might have mentioned briefly in the last video, is that I've made an adjustment layer here which was selecting the sky, and we'll cover making selections in one of the next videos. But here I have an adjustment layer that's applying only to the sky. And if I click on the mask to select it and then hold down the Alt key, click on it again, you can see the mask is overlaid. So white reveals what I'm going to be doing, or reveals the adjustment, and black conceals. So black means that there's going to be no adjustment on the buildings, and white means the adjustment is on the sky. So if I come back, click again with holding the Alt key, that takes us back to the image, and you can see here that what's happened is the sky's darkened. That's all fine, and the sky has become a little bit oversaturated, so we've created another adjustment layer above here where I've selected the blue channel and just reduced the blue colors in saturation. But as a simple way to avoid having to duplicate this mask, because I didn't want to take the blue out of the water or the buildings, was to just what's called clip it to the layer below. And that means that this adjustment layer only affects this layer below, and it's applied to that mask. And how do we do that? Well, when we make an adjustment, or we create an adjustment layer, we get an information panel or a properties panel, and down the bottom of the panel there's a little box there with a little arrow on it. That's called the clipping mask. And what that means, you click on that, it puts this little arrow on the icon, which means that it's now going to be clipped to this layer below. So that's another simple way we can control where the adjustments are applied to our photograph. And if you're not sure exactly what's happening there, you can use your mouse cursor to hover over areas and see what's happening. So if I hover my mouse cursor over here and just hold for a second or so, a little information will pop up saying clipping mask applied. So that's how clipping masks work. Now let's just have a look at the layer above again. I've done a hue saturation adjustment layer here, and what I've done is I've increased the saturation on the yellows. You can see if I turn this layer off and on, I've just boosted the saturation there. Now what would happen if I clip this one to the layer below? Then if I clicked on here, that adjustment would disappear, because now this hue saturation adjustment is being applied down to this area, and the bottom part of the image is masked out, so nothing is going to happen, so that adjustment disappears. So we need to be just mindful when we apply a clipping mask just exactly where it's going to apply. So we can clip on it, clip it to the layer below, and then come back to it, click it again, turns it off. So that's another aspect of using clipping layers. And moving on from looking at the clipping layers, another aspect of working with layers is, in some instances, the order in which you apply these layers is going to have an effect on the image. And in these cases, there's no mask being applied to each of these adjustment layers, but I have here an adjustment layer where I've made a mask around the edges, and let's just hold down the Alt key. We can see that that's just applying to the edges of the image, and if I click on the actual adjustment, all I've done is just darken the edges very slightly. And above here I've got another image layer with a mask, and what I'm going to do is just click on that for the moment, right mouse click, and disable that mask, so we can see the effect of moving this layer above. Now there's no mask applied to this layer now, and it's going to be at 100% opacity, so that it's perfectly opaque to the layers below. And if I turn that mask layer off and on, nothing is visible. But if I was to click on this layer, and if I wanted to move it, all I need to do is click and drag, and you'll see as I move it up, you'll see a little blue line appear. That shows where it's going to go. It's now sitting above this image layer. If I turn that off and on, you'll see the edges of the image get darker. So in some cases, depending on what the layer is above and below the ones you're working on, it may have an effect on the image. So you just need to be mindful of that. I'm just going to take that back down here. If this mask has been disabled, you can see the big red X. All I need to do is click on that again to re-enable it. So this layer, and it was at about 45% opacity, because all we did was just boost those colors a little bit, and then finally this just brightened the overall image. So we've moved some layers around, we've renamed them, and we've looked at clipping masks. So that's a few aspects of working with layers. But wait, there's more. Let's move on to a different image, because I have a few different techniques applied to this particular one. And let's just scroll all the way down to the bottom layer, and if I hover on that area next to the eye and hold down the Alt or Option key, click there, it turns all the other layers off so that we can see exactly what's been done. And what we're going to do now is just show you a couple of other ways we can work with layers. Now I've got a group of layers here. You'll see a little folder here that indicates it's a group, and a little forward facing arrow. If I click on that arrow, that opens it up, and what I've got here is a couple of adjustment layers. And sometimes you might want to apply two different masks to an adjustment, but using the normal adjustment on an adjustment layer, you can only apply the one. So let's have a look at these one by one, and I can turn each of these off or on. If I turn them all off, and we can select this one, and what I've done here is I again hold down the Alt key, click on the mask. I've made a selection of the sky, and what I've done is I've used a clarity and dehaze adjustment layer, because the sky, as you can see when it's turned off, was completely white, but there is detail in the sky. So by applying a clarity and dehaze, I've brought some detail back into the image, but then it wasn't quite enough. So above that, I've applied a curves layer, and you can see I've really dramatically darkened the curves layer. And if I now turn that on, you'll see now that the sky has brought back a lot of detail, and we can see the clouds, and it's much more interesting. And you'll see here that I've applied a clipping mask to this layer because I only wanted to apply to this layer below. So that's all fine. But then typically with a sky, you'll find that the sky is actually darker at the top and it fades away to be a little bit lighter at the bottom. But I've got a mask here that covers the whole sky. Let's just come back to that. We've got the mask, so I don't want to lose that. So how can I make a second mask on this? Well, what we can do is I've selected these two layers. I've clicked on one, hold down the Shift key, click on the second layer, and if we then right mouse click and we can say new group from layers, it now groups those together into the one adjustment. Now I'm not going to do that again because it's already been done. Here it is. And what we can do with that group is now, I'll just remove that. Let's just take that layer mask away. So normally that's what happens. You have a new group. It's just, and I've renamed it Sky, the same way that we rename any of the adjustment layers. And I wanted just to apply a gradient to this area so that it's not as dark at the bottom as it is at the top. So the simple way to do that is to select that heading of the group, come down to the add a mask icon. It's now added a white mask, so that means everything is visible. That's okay so far. But now what I want to do is apply a gradient to that. And over on the left hand side toolbar is the gradient tool. If I click on that and go up to the toolbar above, we have a number of different options as how the gradient's applied. I'm going to click on this one, which is a linear gradient, and I'm starting with white as my foreground color and black as my background color. All I need to do now is come up to the top of the image, and to make sure that this gradient stays in a straight line, if I hold down the Shift key, click and drag, and then I can move this down, and you can see how that mask is being applied. And somewhere down here I'm going to make, that's the end point, and then I've got a midpoint, so I can move that midpoint up and down to give me a bit of a graduated effect so that the effect is greater at the top and less at the bottom. And to see how that works, if I right mouse click and say disable layer mask, you can see that the whole sky is dark down here, and that looks a bit artificial. But then by applying that gradient, I can then feather that down a bit, and I can even move that down a little bit, and there we have it. So that's how to apply a group, or create a group and apply a second mask to an adjustment layer. So that's another aspect of working with layers. Now just one other thing in relation to the masks on layers, and we're going to cover this in another video, but when I've created this gradient mask, its fall off is fairly abrupt. If I come over and do our old trick of holding in the Alt key and clicking on it, you can see that it graduates fairly abruptly. Now, how can I make that softer? Well, I can come back here and I can play around here, and you can see how it moves that edge. But there's another way. I can come over to, having selected my mask, we have the layer mask properties panel here, and what I can do is I can apply more feathering to this, and because it's already highly feathered, I've got to go a long way before I see any real effect. And once I get all the way over to the right hand end, you can start to see that feathering increase. So yep, I'm pretty happy with that. I will leave that as it is, click on Alt and the masks again, and we've got that very nice graduated drop off on our sky adjustment. So that's a way we can work with our adjustment layers. Now above here I've got a couple of other adjustment layers using an image layer. One of my signature techniques is to use a Nik Silver Effects adjustment layer, or not an adjustment layer, an image layer, blended to luminosity to bring out mid-tone details. And you can see the effect when I turn that off and on. It boosts the mid-tones and adds a little bit more presence to the image. However, it does affect slightly the color saturation, so we need to do something else. Now I could do it with the hue saturation adjustment layer, but again I've used another Nik tonal contrast and pro contrast adjustment layer, and if I turn that back on, you'll see that it's actually boosted the colours in the sky quite a bit. But then I realised also prior to this that there was a couple of dust spots on the image, and I also, having created this layer, I did some spot removal. So that's sort of boosted that image a little bit more. But again, we've got this problem with the sky being too saturated. So I've come back again, another adjustment layer, hue saturation. Let's turn it on. And when you're looking at all of the different colors, this tells me what colors are in the photograph. So obviously, if I click on the blue color, that represents the sky. I've taken the blue saturation down considerably, and so that really intense blue has disappeared. But I've also got a yellow area in the image, which is most of the foliage. I've taken that down a little bit too, so it was a little bit too intense. But again, I've selectively applied this by just painting on the mask with black or white, so that I've selectively reduced the color intensity in a couple of areas. And then I've played around a little bit more with another hue saturation adjustment layer, and then done a final curves to add a little bit more contrast, and then applied a slight vignette. So these are all different types of adjustment layers. We're going to cover making selections and applying them to masks in another episode, and we'll cover some of the other aspects of working with Photoshop. So I hope that's all been useful. These are incredible tools working with these adjustment layers. I hope that's added to the pool of knowledge, and we'll look at some other aspects in the next video.